5 minutes to live. That's what the math said. The helicopter was 23 minutes out. I was kneeling in mud and blood next to a 22-year-old kid from Michigan with a hole in his abdomen the size of my fist. And I knew, medically, statistically, biologically, he was already dead. The numbers didn't work. They never worked. But I kept my hands on that wound, and I prayed anyway. September 12th, 1969. Quảng Tri Province, Vietnam. That's the day I watched a man survive something that every piece of medical training I had said was impossible. My name is Thomas Earl Booker. I'm a Christian combat medic. I'm 79 years old. And this is the story of the day the math was wrong. Let me take you back to that morning. September 12th, 1969, Friday. We used to joke that nothing good ever happened on Fridays in the field. Superstition, maybe. But in Vietnam, you held on to whatever small rituals gave you a sense of control. I'd been in country 6 months by then, long enough to stop flinching at every sound, long enough to know the difference between incoming and outgoing fire by ear, long enough to have seen too many men die, but not long enough to be numb. I don't think you ever get numb. You just get better at functioning while it's happening. That morning, my platoon was on routine patrol about 4 kilometers north of base camp. Dense jungle. Hot. The kind of heat that soaks through your uniform and stays there all day. We were moving slow. Single file, eyes scanning the trees. Rob Hayes was near the middle of the column. I was about 10 men back. Rob had been with us 3 months, from Lansing, Michigan. 22 years old, tall, blonde hair always a little too long for regulation. He had one of those faces that still looked like a kid, the kind of face that didn't belong in a war. He talked about his girlfriend a lot. Sarah, high school sweethearts. He carried her picture in his helmet, showed it to anyone who would look. Told the same stories over and over. How they met, their first date, the plan to get married as soon as he got home. Most of us learned not to make too many plans out loud, but Rob couldn't help himself. He was an optimist, even in Vietnam, even in September of 1969. That's who he was. So when the ambush hit, and I heard someone scream, "Hayes is down," my stomach dropped. The first shots came from the west, AK-47 fire, automatic, close. We hit the ground, returned fire, someone yelling coordinates into the radio, someone else yelling for a medic. That was me. I grabbed my kit and ran low toward the sound. Didn't think, just moved. Found Rob about 15 meters off the trail, on his back, hands pressed against his stomach. I dropped next to him. "Rob, look at me. Where'd you get hit?" He couldn't speak, just looked at me with this expression. Not pain, not fear, confusion, like he couldn't process what had just happened to his body. I pulled his hands away, saw the wound. Entry wound, lower left abdomen, high velocity round, probably 7.62. No exit wound. I ripped open his uniform, applied pressure. That's when I knew. This wasn't a wound you survive in the field. This was a wound you survive in an operating room, with a team of surgeons, with blood transfusions, with everything we didn't have. I checked his pulse. Rapid, weak, thready, checked his eyes, pupils dilating, checked his breathing, shallow, fast. All the signs, hypovolemic shock, massive internal bleeding, liver damage, maybe spleen, maybe intestines. He was dying. I grabbed the radio. "Doc Booker, I need a dust-off now. Abdominal GSW. Critical. How far out?" The voice crackled back. "Dust-off inbound. ETA 23 minutes. I looked at Rob, still conscious, still looking at me. And I did the math. I'd been trained in combat medicine. I knew the statistics. I knew what happens to the human body when the liver is destroyed and blood pressure drops, and there's no way to replace the volume you're losing. With this kind of wound, without immediate surgical intervention, you have minutes. 4 Maybe 6 if you're lucky. 23 minutes wasn't possible, but I couldn't tell him that, so I lied. Rob, you're going to be fine. Helicopter's coming. You're going to make it. You hear me? He tried to nod. Couldn't. I kept pressure on the wound. Grabbed plasma from my kit. Started an IV line in his arm. The firefight was still going on around us. Bullets snapping through the trees. Someone yelling to fall back. I didn't hear any of it. All I heard was Rob's breathing getting slower. All I saw was his skin getting paler. All I knew was that I was watching a 22-year-old kid from Michigan die, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. And that's when I prayed. I don't know why. I prayed over dying men before. Sometimes it helped me. I don't know if it helped them. But I prayed, not out loud, just in my head. Just a few words. God, if you're there, give me more time. Just enough time to get him on that helicopter alive. That's all I'm asking. Just let him make it that far. I didn't pray for him to survive. I'd learned by then not to pray for outcomes I couldn't control. I prayed for time. 5 more minutes. 10 more minutes. Anything. And I kept working. Reapplied pressure. Checked the IV. Monitored his pulse every 30 seconds. 3 minutes passed. Rob's pulse was still there. Weaker, but there. 5 minutes. Still breathing. Barely. I checked my watch. The helicopter was 18 minutes out. Rob should have been unconscious by now. Should have been in full shock. Should have been gone. But he wasn't. His eyes were still open. Still focused on me. Stay with me, Rob. Stay with me. He blinked. Once. Slow. 10 minutes. I couldn't believe he was still conscious. Couldn't believe his heart was still beating. The bleeding hadn't stopped. The wound was still catastrophic. Nothing about the situation had changed. Except he was still alive. 15 minutes. I heard the helicopter in the distance. The sound of rotor blades cutting through air. The most beautiful sound in the world. I looked at Rob. You hear that? That's your ride. You're getting out of here. He tried to smile. Didn't quite make it. But I saw the effort. 20 minutes. The Huey landed in the clearing. 2 medics jumped out with a stretcher. I briefed them fast. Abdominal GSW. Suspected liver damage. Massive internal bleeding. He's been down for 20 minutes. IV in the left arm. Pressure on the wound. Get him to surgery now. They loaded him onto the stretcher. Lifted him into the helicopter. And Rob Hayes, who by every measure of medical science should have been dead 15 minutes ago, was still breathing. I watched the helicopter lift off, watched it disappear over the trees, and I didn't know what to think. I didn't know what to feel. I just stood there in the clearing, trying to understand what had just happened. 2 weeks later, I got word. Rob had made it through surgery. Stable condition. Expected to recover. I asked how that was possible. The field report said he'd been down for over 20 minutes before they got him into the OR. The nurse just shrugged. Miracles happen, but that's not what the surgeon said. 3 days after that, I was back at base. The lead surgeon, Major William Chen, 30 years in the Army, 2 tours in Korea, found me in the mess hall. He sat down across from me. Didn't say anything for a moment. Just looked at me. Then he said, "You're the medic who brought in Robert Hayes, the Abdominal GSW on the 12th. I said yes. He opened a folder. My field report. You wrote here that he was down for 23 minutes in the field before the medevac arrived. That he was conscious when you loaded him onto the helicopter." I said, "That's right." He looked at me. "I've been doing this for 30 years. Korea, Vietnam. I've seen a lot of abdominal trauma, and I'm telling you, what you described in this report, a high-velocity round through the lower left abdomen, suspected liver laceration, massive internal bleeding, conscious and stable after 23 minutes with no surgical intervention. That doesn't happen." I didn't say anything, he continued. When we opened him up, his liver was destroyed. Not damaged, destroyed. He'd lost over 40% of his blood volume. By every measure, he should have been in irreversible shock within 5 minutes. He should have been dead before that helicopter ever got to you. I said, but he wasn't. Major Chen nodded. No, he wasn't. And I don't know why. He closed the folder, looked at me again. Did you do something different? Some technique I'm not aware of? I shook my head. I did what I was trained to do. Pressure on the wound, IV fluids, monitored vitals. That's it. And he stayed conscious the whole time? Most of it. He faded near the end. But yeah, he was awake. Major Chen was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Well, I don't have an explanation. Medically, it doesn't make sense. But he's alive, and he's going home. So whatever you did, it worked." He stood up, started to walk away, then turned back. Off the record, I've seen a few cases like this over the years. Not many, maybe 3 or 4. Cases where the patient survives something they absolutely shouldn't survive. And every time, there's no medical explanation. The numbers don't add up. The biology doesn't support it. But they live anyway. He paused. Some people call it luck. Some call it a miracle. I just call it a mystery. And he left. I sat there in the mess hall for a long time after that, trying to process what he'd said, trying to figure out if I believed in miracles. That evening, I went to the base chapel, small wooden building at the edge of camp. Nobody there except the chaplain, Father William McCarthy. Everyone called him Bill. 82 years old, older than anyone had any business being in a war zone. Irish, veteran of Korea. Had been a chaplain for 40 years. He was sitting in the front pew reading when I walked in. Looked up, saw my face. "Rough day, Thomas." I sat down next to him, told him the whole story. Rob Hayes. The 23 minutes. The surgeon's words. The impossibility of it all. Bill listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know what your problem is, lad?" I said no. "You're trying to understand it." I looked at him. He continued, "You're a medic. You're trained to think in terms of cause and effect. Wound plus treatment equals outcome. But sometimes, not often mind you, but sometimes, the equation doesn't balance. And when that happens, you have 2 choices. You can drive yourself mad trying to make it make sense, or you can accept that some things are bigger than your understanding." I said, "So you think it was God?" Bill laughed, not mockingly, warmly. "Thomas, I've been a priest for 53 years. I've given last rites to men who survived, and first communion to boys who died 3 days later. I've seen prayers answered in ways that made no sense, and prayers ignored that should have been shouted from heaven. And you know what I've learned? God doesn't explain himself. Not to me, not to you, not to anyone. He just is. And sometimes he shows up in ways we can't predict or control or understand. And when he does, our job isn't to figure it out. Our job is to witness it. To say, I saw this, I don't know what it means. But I saw it, and then keep walking. I sat with that for a while. Then I said, but why Rob? Why not the others? I prayed over other men too. Men who didn't make it. Bill nodded. I know. And that's the question that'll haunt you if you let it. Why one and not another? Why this prayer and not that one? I don't have an answer for you, Thomas. Nobody does. But I'll tell you what I tell everyone who asks me that question. He put his hand on my shoulder. Maybe it's not about why. Maybe it's about what you do with it. You witness something impossible. A 22-year-old boy lived when he shouldn't have. That happened. You can spend the rest of your life trying to understand why, or you can spend it being grateful that it did. And maybe Just maybe letting it change how you see the world. I said, how? That's the better question. Then he stood up, stretched, looked at his watch. Well, I've got confessions in 10 minutes. And let me tell you, you medics have nothing on what some of these boys confess to. Last week, Private Henderson told me he'd been stealing communion wafers because he thought they'd keep him safe in combat. Been eating them like trail mix for 2 months. I stared at him. Bill shrugged. I told him if he wanted protection, he should try praying instead of treating the body of Christ like a snack food. But honestly, the lad's still alive, so who am I to judge? And he walked out, leaving me sitting there, trying not to laugh. That was Bill. Always knew exactly when to break the tension. Rob Hayes went home to Michigan in March of 1970. Married Sarah that summer. Had 3 kids. Worked as a high school shop teacher for 35 years. I never spoke to him after Vietnam. Don't know if he remembers that day the way I do. Don't know if he thinks about it. I think about it all the time. Not because I need to understand it. I've made peace with not understanding. But because it taught me something important. It taught me that faith isn't about having all the answers. It's not about being certain. It's not about knowing how things work. Faith is about doing what you can with what you have, even when the math says it won't be enough. It's about praying even when you don't know if anyone's listening. It's about working on a dying man for 23 minutes when every piece of training you have says he'll be dead in 5. It's about refusing to give up, even when giving up makes logical sense. Because sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the impossible happens. And when it does, you don't get an explanation. You don't get a neat answer. You don't get closure. You just get a 22-year-old kid from Michigan who lives when he shouldn't have. And that has to be enough. I don't know if God saved Rob Hayes that day. I don't know if it was a miracle or luck or skill or some combination of all 3. What I know is this. I prayed for time, and I got it. I prayed for him to make it to the helicopter alive, and he did. I prayed for something I couldn't control, and it happened anyway. That doesn't prove anything. It doesn't answer the big questions. It doesn't explain why Rob lived and others didn't. But it taught me that prayer isn't about getting what you want. It's about asking for what you need, doing everything you can, and then accepting whatever comes next, even if what comes next doesn't make sense, especially if it doesn't make sense. I'm 79 years old now. I've lived more than half a century since that day in September of 1969. And I still carry Rob Hayes with me, not as trauma, not as burden, as reminder. A reminder that the universe is bigger than my understanding, that mystery is part of life, that some questions don't have answers, and that's okay. You don't need to understand everything to keep moving forward. You don't need to have it all figured out to have faith. You just need to do the next right thing, and then the next one, and then the next. And sometimes, when you do that, something impossible happens, and you get to witness it. That's what I learned in Vietnam, from a 22-year-old kid from Michigan who survived 23 minutes that should have killed him in 5. I don't have an explanation. I just have the story, and maybe that's enough. If you're watching this, maybe you're looking for answers too. Maybe you're trying to make sense of something that doesn't make sense. Maybe you've experienced something you can't explain. I can't give you answers. I don't have them, but I can tell you this. It's okay not to know. It's okay to live with mystery. It's okay to have faith even when the math doesn't add up. Because sometimes the math is wrong, and the person lives anyway. But I need to tell you something else. Something I haven't told anyone in 56 years. Because Rob Hayes wasn't the only soldier I prayed over in Vietnam. And not all of them made it. 3 months before Rob survived the impossible, I knelt in a different jungle clearing, next to a different soldier, my brother, Calvin Booker, 21 years old. Infantry, 23rd Infantry Division. I prayed over him too. God didn't give me 23 minutes that time. He gave me 3, and then he took him. That's the story I've never told. The one I've carried for 56 years without speaking it out loud. The story of the day I learned that sometimes you pray and the impossible happens. And sometimes you pray and it doesn't. And you have to live with both of those truths at the same time. Next week, I'm going to tell you about Calvin. Not because I have answers, but because some stories need to be told, even when they don't end the way you prayed they would. My name is Thomas Earl Booker. I'm a Christian combat medic, and I'll see you next week.